and welcome to Crimes Through Time. This is the fourth in a 5-part series into the women of the Whitechapel murders 1888. The links for Part 1, Mary Ann Polly Nichols, Part 2, Annie Chapman, and Part 3, Elizabeth Stride, are in the description below. The focus of this episode is Catherine Kate Eddowes. The Eddowes would leave Wolverhampton in the north of England, a place where the family had laid roots for generations, in June 1843. George and Catherine Eddowes, along with 9-year-old Alfred, Harriet 8, Emma 7, Eliza 6, and Elizabeth 4, as well as their youngest baby Catherine, or Kate as she was known, born just the year before on the 14th of April 1842, all boarded a canal boat for the 2-day journey to London. For generations, the men of the Eddowes family would work in the tin trade, one of the principal industries of Wolverhampton. George was no exception. He started his 7-year apprenticeship at the age of 14 in 1822 at the Old Hall Works, a tin works that since 1767 was based in a decaying Elizabethan manor house surrounded by fields on the outside of the city. His father John would go on to be celebrated as the factory's most senior worker. But things were changing in the industry. Machines were being introduced and taking men's jobs. There had been growing unrest between employers and their workers since the 1820s. In anticipation of industrial action, the Friendly Society of the United Operative Tin Plate Workers of Wolverhampton, or the Tin Man Society, was formed, meeting regularly in the Red Cow from 1834. They drew up a strategy to protect workers' interests, including a book of rates that would standardise workers' pay. In 1842, they requested all 6 local factories sign up. Positively, most did, including William Wrighton, owner of the Old Hall Works. Unfortunately, George and his brother William had recently found employment at a works owned by Edward Perry, who vehemently rejected the proposal. The Tin Man Society called for a strike, and by January 1843, 35 men had walked off their jobs, including the Eddowes brothers, who had been instrumental in persuading others to do the same. Edward was determined to personally pursue each striker and prosecute them for breach of contract. The community surrounding the tin plate workers was divided, and it would soon turn to violence. On the 9th of January, George and William were drinking in the Merrydale Tavern when an altercation broke out between them and Richard Fenton, a colleague of theirs who had not gone on strike. George reportedly shouted, "You have a brother on strike, you shabby devil," before punching and kicking Richard. Within minutes, 9 others joined the fight, including William and his wife Elizabeth, calling, "We'll murder him, murder the bastard," as Richard tried to flee upstairs. The incident was more than a pub brawl. Richard was lucky to have escaped with his life. William realised the real consequences of the situation and went into hiding, leaving his wife Elizabeth to stand trial. On the 15th of February, a notice was placed in the Wolverhampton Chronicle by Edward Perry, asking for information about those instrumental in convincing people to strike. By the 24th of March, all fingers were pointing at George, and he was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 2 months' hard labour in Stafford Jail. This meant the treadmills, a set of steps set into iron wheels used to mill corn or pump water. George understood fully the risks of his actions. He was compensated by the union for his loyalty, but he had 0 chance of working in Wolverhampton again. Thus the move down to the capital, where the union had set him up with a skilled mechanic's job at Perkins and Sharpus, a tin and copperware manufacturer located near London Bridge. They found a house at 4 Baden Place. Life would have been comfortable had the couple not had 6 children under 10. Catherine Evans was the second of 7 children. She had an average childhood for the era, the daughter of a latchmaker. She started working as a kitchen maid in the Peacock Inn and worked her way up to cook. In 1812, at 18 years old, she met and married George. 4 babies followed in the first 5 years of their marriage. Alfred, their oldest, had a mental disability and suffered from epileptic fits. Catherine worked full-time in the home, taking care of Alfred and the other small children. This meant the financial burden fell to George. Catherine lived, just as her mother and grandmother did, as an example of what 19th century maternal rights campaigner Margaret Llewellyn Davis called a life of excessive childbearing. Women lacked information about preventing pregnancy. They were often trapped in a cycle of poverty and felt a deep obligation to be a dutiful wife. Almost constant childbearing took its toll physically and emotionally on Catherine and stretched the family resources to breaking point. If food didn't go far enough, it was Catherine, as the mother, who went without. She would tend the home right up to the day she gave birth, and if money didn't allow for a person to be paid to assist, she would be back cooking, cleaning and lifting within days of giving birth, whatever was required, often with medical consequences. After the family settled in London, more babies arrived. Thomas in 1844, George in 1846, John in 1849, Sarah Ann in 1850, Mary in 1852, and finally William in 1854. One would leave the nest only to be replaced by another mouth to feed. The expanding family moved 4 times during 1843 to 1857. The girls became known as the Seven Sisters. They were always on time with their rent and bills, a point of pride and respectability amongst their neighbours. At this time, 48.9% of English women could not sign their own name. Of Kate's older sisters, only Emma could write, evidenced by the crosses they marked on their marriage certificates in place of signatures. Kate, and possibly Emma, was enrolled in Dowgate School in 1848, an honour for a working-class family. It was located just minutes from George's work. It adhered to the religious-based curriculum of the national system, and she received education in reading, writing and arithmetic, with Bible studies and music. Extra lessons were given in needlework. The mission of the school was to elevate the working class. Cleanliness and respectability were strictly enforced. Each child wore a uniform, which the child themselves took personal responsibility for its upkeep and hygiene. They had to have clean faces and hands. A haircut was required every 6 weeks. It was viewed as giving the child a stepping stone out of poverty. Why Kate was selected is unknown. Birth order would have played a part, as the older siblings were expected to look after the younger ones. She did have an aptitude for learning the family wanted to encourage. It was remarked that she, quote, possessed an unusual degree of intelligence. Emma would describe her sister at this time as, quote, lively, warm-hearted and entertaining. On the 26th of June 1851, Edmund Calvert, the owner of nearby Calvert & Co. Brewery, hosted a day trip to the recently opened Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. It was one of the first World's Fairs, and the Great Exhibition was a plate glass structure unlike anything ever seen in Britain before. For a 9-year-old Kate Eddowes, it must have been a dazzling sight. Kate would turn 14 in April 1856, ending her education. This coincided with the dissolution of George's employer, Perkins and Sharpus. It was urgent that Kate find work. However, tragedy was around the corner for the family. Catherine had been suffering from a cough throughout 1855, and she had become thin, weak and feverish. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis. She passed away on the 17th of November 1856, her body ravaged by childbearing, physical labour and malnutrition. She was 42, which was the average life expectancy for Victorian working-class women. In 1857, George began to sicken. They all knew it was terminal. Tuberculosis was a death sentence at this time. Elizabeth Eddowes was now 19, and she agreed to marry her beau and neighbour Thomas Fisher. The service took place at St Paul's Church in Bermondsey on the 27th of September 1857. George, even though he was gravely ill, walked his daughter down the aisle and gave her away. he put his ex on the line as a witness. The elder Eddowes sisters began to plan for their futures, and who, if any of them, could care for Alfred and the youngest children. Taken from Emma's account, published in the Manchester Weekly Times in 1888, Harriet had settled with Robert Carter Garrett, although they weren't married at this time. She nursed George as he sickened and looked after the young children. Eliza took a job in service. Elizabeth and her new husband ran a bird shop in Locksfield. Emma took a position in a household on Lower Craven Place in Kentish Town. But it was Kate and what would become of her that worried the sisters the most. It is unclear why, but given the utterly free spirit of a woman Kate became, I am sure there was a good reason for their concern. Harriet wrote to their aunt and uncle William and Elizabeth in Wolverhampton to see if Kate could, quote, get a situation away from London. They agreed, but they couldn't pay the train fare. Emma would go as far as asking her employer to pay for the fare, which they did. Whether Kate had any choice in the matter is unclear, but probably not. George would pass away on the 9th of December 1857. None of the older children had the resources to care for Alfred and the younger children. It may have been as soon as the day of the funeral that 23-year-old Alfred, Thomas 13, George 11, Sarah Ann 7, Mary 5 all entered Bermondsey Union Workhouse as orphans. But all was not lost for these young children. There is a positive outcome for them, which I will get to in due course. Alone, Kate boarded the train in December 1857 to Wolverhampton, a daunting ride taking her back to a birthplace she didn't remember, to live with relatives who were little more than strangers. This area of England is referred to as the Black Country. It was an area of vast industry, chain making, brick baking, steel forging, and of course tin works, dominated the landscape, fed from the 30-foot deep vein of coal that ran through the countryside. Charles Dickens would describe it as, quote, on every side, and as far as the eye could see, into the heavy distance, tall chimneys crowding on each other, and presenting that endless repetition of the same dull, ugly form, which is the horror of oppressive dreams, pouring out their plague of smoke, obscured the light and made the foul the melancholy air. Kate's approach to the city would have been crowded with mounds of ash. It is likely that this is the first time that she had met her Aunt Elizabeth and her father's brother William when she moved in with them and their 3 children, Sarah 14, William 13 and Lizzie 5, at 50 Bilson Street. Around the corner lived her grandparents, Thomas and Mary, and her Uncle John and his 4 children lived close by. The family would have felt much grief of the loss of Catherine and George, but losing parents early was par for the course in Victorian society, so there was an expectation that Kate would just carry on regardless. She secured a position as a scourer at the Old Hall Works. This was a source of pride for the family. After the industrial unrest, the new owner, Benjamin Walton, welcomed the Eddowes back with open arms. Life for Kate was routine: work, eat, sleep and repeat. As she entered her late teens, Sarah left for a position in domestic service, but her aunt soon gave birth to Harriet. Kate would now be expected to help with the younger children and tend the home, as well as her responsibilities at work. In the summer of 1861, Kate was caught stealing from the Old Hall Works. It was only the fact that she was an Eddowes that charges weren't laid against her. Instead, she was scolded and dismissed from her position. Her family were deeply hurt and embarrassed by her actions. News even got back to London and her older sisters. Her family could not forgive this betrayal of trust, and at 19 years old, Kate packed up to start a new life, this time in Birmingham, a 14-mile walk away. The Peacock Inn, where Kate's mother Catherine once worked, used to host bare-knuckle boxing matches. Among those that fought there was the English heavyweight champion William Perry, the Tipton Slasher, as well as Joe Goss, who would later find fame and fortune in the United States. Another boxer frequently on the card was Tom Eddowes, Kate's uncle, a shoemaker or snob by trade, who supplemented his income by prize fighting. Kate would often watch him starstruck in the crowd. It is Tom that Kate hoped would take her in. Tom Eddowes and his wife Rosanna lived in the heart of industrial Birmingham with their 2 children, John 16 and Mary 12. There was a constant noise in the air from the thud of the factories. The water was unfit to drink and the residents relied on deliveries by cart. Kate did find a home with them in a courtyard off Moreland Street. But soon life returned to the same routine for Kate. Tom found her a job in a factory polishing the faces of newly shellacked Japanware trays. She would rise at dawn, work till dusk, home for supper and then to bed, which she shared with Mary. This would be Kate's life until marriage and then motherhood, a life likely to emulate Catherine's: excessive childbirth, worry, hunger, fatigue, until eventual sickness and death. Kate was a free spirit and this would not be her life, especially once she met Thomas Conway. Thomas Quinn was born on the 21st of November 1836 in County Mayo. It is unknown why he changed his name to Conway when he enlisted in the 18th Royal Irish Regiment of the Army in October 1857, but it is not unusual for a man who took the Queen's shilling to reinvent themselves, to escape their past and find a new future. There had been a rebellion of the British East India troops near Delhi, and it had grown and was threatening the north of the country. Thomas must have known that enlisting when he did would mean deployment to India. He received a month's training before boarding the steamship Princess Charlotte en route to Bombay, a journey that would take 3 months. The extreme change in climate and culture took its toll, with many soldiers succumbing to the weather and the melancholy of homesickness. The humidity would enter Thomas's chest. He would eventually be sent to an army hospital near Madras for treatment and recuperation. The rebellion was quashed during this time and he returned to Dublin in 1861. He would be discharged from the army on the grounds of ill health, principally rheumatism and chronic bronchitis, but the doctor would also find, quote, a disease of the heart. At only 24, Thomas couldn't return to the military or return to physical labour. He was awarded a pension which was paid out twice a year. It was on average 6p a day. His first port of call after being discharged in October 1861 was Kilkerry, to visit with his family before deciding to make the move to England. Firstly to Newcastle. He decided to become a Chapman, a sort of travelling salesman. He purchased all the necessary goods to begin a peddler's life. He travelled to Coventry, on to London, and then in the summer of 1862, Thomas Conway arrived in Birmingham. There he would meet Kate, a, quote, nice-looking girl with a very warm heart. She was 20 years old. Kate made the decision to move back to Wolverhampton just 9 months after arriving at her uncle's, which coincidentally was exactly where Thomas was travelling to. For Kate, Thomas was the key to a life of excitement and freedom. He told her tales of tigers and jungles in his songs and stories. He could pick up and move whenever the mood took him, a far cry from the rigid routine that was Kate's life. Her family saw him more as a one-way ticket to poverty, starvation and the workhouse. He also didn't seem to be in a rush to commit to Kate, if he actually proposed at all. Her family would never warm to Thomas. Kate was given an ultimatum by her Aunt Elizabeth: finish the affair or leave. She left, and joined Thomas in his boarding house. By July 1862, she was pregnant. Working class people were more practical, so while there was some shame and stigma about being an unwed mother with a partner, and certainly Kate's family didn't approve, but it wasn't the end of the world. Many, like Kate, chose to cohabit instead of legally marry. These relationships were monogamous and long-lasting. The etiquette was if a couple said they were married and behaved accordingly, they were married. But the consequences of being left with illegitimate children were still for the woman to bear. Men could walk away no problem. Women would be left with reduced earnings, extra mouths to feed, along with the social stigma. Kate knew all the risks, but Thomas was who she wanted to be with. They would soon leave Wolverhampton and head down to Birmingham. Together they would form a business partnership. Alone, Thomas could go door to door in small rural areas, but together they could find sales in larger towns and cities. Thomas also had ambitions of writing his own ballads and stories, but from his army discharge paperwork, he was illiterate. Kate was a very competent writer, and they would go on to compose together. The exciting and carefree life that Kate thought she was embarking on was far from the reality of living this transient lifestyle. Average earnings were 10 to 12 shillings a week, but illness, drunkenness, or any unforeseen circumstances would have a severe impact on their quality of life. Kate would have been sodden from the rain, frozen, have dirty clothes and an empty belly. Laundry and bathing were now luxuries. In rural villages, they were often taken in and given a bed for the night, but in cities they would have to use cheap lodging houses, the casual ward, or sleep rough. They would carry all of their possessions with them, making them constant targets of tricksters and thieves. In April 1863, Kate, now 9 months pregnant, entered the infirmary at the workhouse in Great Yarmouth, Norfolk. By the 1860s, workhouses accommodated destitute expectant mothers, but the guardians would still distinguish between deserving married women and fallen women. Kate gave her name as Catherine Conway and claimed to be married to a labourer. Thomas may have been with her, but most likely, knowing Kate was safe, he left in search of work. Baby Catherine Annie Conway was born on the 18th of April 1863. There was no separate ward to give birth in. She would have laboured in the general ward alongside those ill with contagious diseases. The sanitation was awful, but still a lot better than giving birth by the side of the road. In the early years of Annie's life, the family continued their travels around the country. In June 1864, they stopped in London. Annie would have slept in stable stalls, churchyards, against walls, in all the weather Britain could offer. It was a hard life, but Kate enjoyed the performance, singing and storytelling, along with the writing. On the 9th of January 1866, the couple would finally find some success with a ballad they had written. The subject of their composition, Charles Christopher Robinson, to mark the day of his execution. The twist was that Charles was Kate's distant cousin. The couple set up their stall at Stafford Jail. Hangings had begun to wane in popularity, but the event had the excitement of a fair or a market day. It had been a long time since a person had been hanged for a crimson crime. Charles had been left an orphan. He was taken in by Josiah Fisher, a relative that worked as a house agent in Wolverhampton. Josiah, by all accounts, was a good man, well respected in the community and of means. He also acted as guardian for Harriet Seeger, the sister of his son's wife. Charles and Harriet were of a similar age, and with time they fell in love and got engaged. Charles was well known for his anger and jealousy. On the 26th of August 1865, Charles was seen in the street, dishevelled and wearing only his shirt. He found Harriet and they argued, during which he attempted to grab her and kiss her. She rebuffed his advances and he slapped her. They parted ways. A short time later, back at Josiah's house, Charles was seen by a servant going down to the scullery with a razor. Then a shot rang out. He had attempted to take his life first by a razor to the throat and then by shooting himself. Harriet was found next to him with, quote, a gash in the throat that had laid the spine bare. How well Kate knew Charles is unknown, but the sake of good business, they were really close. Wolverhampton archives possess a copy of the only publication believed to be linked to Thomas Conway and Kate Eddowes. Snappily titled, Verses on the Awful Execution of Charles Christopher Robinson for the Murder of His Sweetheart Harriet Seeger of Ablow Street, Wolverhampton, August 26. The lyrics were interesting. They paint Charles as a remorseful figure worthy of pity. Here is a sample. Charles Robinson is my name, with sorrow was oppressed. The very thought of what I've done deprives me of my rest. Within the walls of Stafford jail, in the bitter grief did cry, and every moment seemed to say, poor soul, prepare to die. How Kate felt about seeing the execution of her cousin, or whether she mourned, is unknown, but the ballad was an exceptional success. They returned from Stafford in style, booking inside seats on the ward's coach. Thomas invested in a donkey and cart and ordered 400 more copies from his printer, which he sold the following Monday at one of his regular pitches. Kate was rewarded with a flowered hat. Thomas began to plan a permanent move to London, where he believed his talents would now be fully appreciated, and where Kate would reunite with her sisters. In contrast to Kate, her sisters took more conventional paths in life. In 1860, Emma, aged 25, met a neighbour of Harriet's, James Jones. He and his family were tallow chandlers. They made and sold candles. They married on the 11th of November and would go on to have 6 children. Eliza wed James Gold, a butcher, in 1859, and Harriet and Robert Garrett would legally marry in 1867 after living together for some time. The probable reason for this is that they then went on to start a family. Eliza, Emma and Harriet all lived just streets apart in Bermondsey. Elizabeth lived in Greenwich with her husband Thomas Fisher, and all 4 were in regular contact and had a very close relationship. Kate would not be completely forthcoming with her sisters about her lifestyle. She told Emma that they had been settled in Birmingham rather than travelling. Her marital status raised eyebrows, but what shocked them was the tattoo of TC inked on Kate's forearm. Tattoos in the middle of the Victorian era were linked to the worst elements of society. They indicated poverty, vice and criminality, and that was on men. On women, it flouted the rules of femininity and purity. It made the woman masculine. The procedure involved a needle, a pot of ink and a succession of sustained pricks. It was dirty and painful, and it challenged a woman's natural delicacy. But as with all of Kate's life decisions, she cared not for social convention or the stigma that followed it. It is possible that Thomas also had a tattoo, and for the couple it indicated their commitment rather than a wedding ring. After returning to London, the couple decided to settle, and by 1868 they lived in a clean and comfortable house at 13 Cottage Place in Westminster. Kate would have 2 more children, Thomas Lawrence Conway, and in March 1869, Harriet. Westminster was an area renowned for artists and peddlers, but even though London offered a wider market, Thomas was unable to establish himself. Now fixed in one place with little babies, he returned to manual labour as an assistant bricklayer despite his heart condition. Money was tight and resources dwindled. Within 3 weeks, baby Harriet would pass away from malnutrition while Kate held her in her arms. By the end of 1869, Thomas left London in search of work. Kate, Annie now 7, and Thomas 2 possibly went to live with Elizabeth, but the house was overcrowded, and on the 20th of January 1870, the 3 entered the Greenwich Union Workhouse. Over the next 10 years, Kate would re-enter the workhouse a number of times. In 1873, she gave birth to George Alfred Conway in the maternity wing of Suffolk Workhouse. Sometimes she stayed weeks, sometimes months. On all occasions, at least one child was with her. The Poor Law meant that single mothers with illegitimate children were unable to receive outside relief or parish handouts so they could remain in their own homes. They worried that doing so would be the same as state-subsidised prostitution by helping these immoral women. Kate was poor and in a cohabiting long-term monogamous relationship, but no distinction was made between these, quote, fallen women and actual prostitutes to maintain a respectable society. In November 1876, Kate enters Greenwich Union Workhouse to give birth to Frederick. George 3 was able to stay with Kate, but Annie 13 and Thomas 8 were sent to industrial school in Sutton. One of the very few positives of the workhouse is that both boys and girls were provided at least 3 hours of education in literacy and numeracy per day. Industrial schools began in 1857, and on top of the basic education, the pupils were given occupational training. For boys, that was shoemaking, tailoring, carpentry and music. For girls, domestic skills, needlework and knitting, to prepare them for jobs in service. At Sutton, the facilities were considered state-of-the-art and allowed those who attended to break out of the cycle of poverty. But Annie and Thomas wouldn't be the first of the Eddowes family to attend Sutton. When Kate's siblings entered the workhouse after their father's death, they too were sent there. George trained as a shoemaker. Thomas was a talented musician and joined the band of the 45th Nottinghamshire Regiment of Infantry in Preston. Mary excelled in her studies and was placed as a servant. Had Kate been a little younger, she may also have entered the workhouse and been sent to Sutton, rather than up to Wolverhampton. Life might have unfolded for Kate in a very different direction. In the late 1870s, Kate and Thomas fell into an awful cycle. Thomas would leave London to find work, leaving Kate with no way to support the family, and they would end up in the workhouse. The couple began to argue, and Thomas turned violent. One reoccurring source of conflict was Kate's excessive drinking. Thomas was abstinent. The Victorian attitude to domestic violence was that it was acceptable as a disciplinary practice within a household at the man's discretion. A woman would be made to feel like she was asking for it, whether that was voicing her opinion, not tending the house to a standard her partner found acceptable, or any other behaviour he found unbecoming. Alcohol and drunkenness was seen as a very good reason to give a woman a beating. It was even a legal defence against assault charges. Given this, Annie and Kate's sisters believed that Kate and her behaviour was to blame for the violence she was enduring. They did offer indirect assistance, giving Kate a place to stay to avoid Thomas's anger or to sober up and avoid a confrontation. Between November 1876 and December 1877, Kate entered the workhouse 7 times. And on the 6th of August 1877, she was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. She was sentenced to 14 days in Wandsworth Prison. On all the occasions, including prison, some of her children accompanied her. In December 1877, Kate left Thomas and took 9-month-old Frederick to the casual ward of the workhouse for the night. They reconciled and celebrated Christmas Day as a family with her sisters. Both of Kate's eyes were black and she, quote, bore a dreadful face. Thomas showed no remorse, even commenting, quote, Kate, I will be hanged for you one of these days. Kate had gotten drunk, and from that day a rift began between her sisters, to the point that Emma and Harriet cut ties with Kate. Kate and Thomas always got back together, trapping them and their children in a cycle of domestic violence. A short period of stability, followed by violence and chaos, and back again. They moved frequently, and money was tight. Annie was now old enough to look after her younger siblings, and Kate returned to work. By 1879, the couple were back to selling ballads together at their regular patch in Mill Lane near Woolwich Army Barracks. During this time, Frederick passed away, another baby that failed to thrive. From here, Kate's mental state and alcohol consumption spirals. On the 4th of October, Thomas 11 and George 6 were with their parents as they hawked their ballads. Eager to chase the sales, both Kate and Thomas wander off, leaving the children unattended. When night falls, they are taken to Greenwich Workhouse. It would be a week before Kate reappeared to claim them. This repeated itself on the 11th of November, only it was the police that took them to the workhouse this time. After a month, 16-year-old Annie would claim her brothers. Where Kate was during this period is unknown, but it is likely alcohol played a part. The Conways' relationship would limp on until autumn 1881. Thomas, when interviewed in 1888, would insist that he left Kate and took the children because of her drinking. Elizabeth denied that, saying Kate initiated the split because of the violence and that they hadn't spent a full year together in a very long time. Following the split, Kate moved in with Elizabeth, but her drinking and the behaviour when drunk was too much. She was arrested in September 1881 for drunk and disorderly after being dragged from the streets for yelling obscenities at passers-by. She narrowly avoided jail, but Elizabeth, like Emma and Harriet, cut ties with Kate. This left her Eliza, her one remaining sister. Eliza had recently become a widow. Her husband, although a butcher, made no provision for her. She had no savings, no pension, and a son too young to work. Eliza needed a new partner. Her second husband was Charles Frost, although they would never legally tie the knot. He was also widowed and worked at the docks. Eliza and Charles lived in Whitechapel. Eliza, her son, Charles and his daughter all lived together at 5 Thrall Street. Kate would visit often for food and a few pennies. She would lodge at Cooney's, 55 Flower and Dean Street. It was here that she met John Kelly. The Eddowes sisters despised John, and Annie, who blamed her mother for splitting up the family, said, quote, "I've never spoken to him, and I don't like him." John himself was quiet and inoffensive, but unlike Thomas, he drank heavily. Kate and John were a popular couple in the lodging houses. Kate would entertain with a song. She was generous and caring, happy to help those who hadn't made their DOS money. Kate took work charring for Jewish families, and John worked at the market. Money was tight, and they couldn't afford the lodging house every night. John stated at the inquest they would stay for a night or two in Cooney's or 52 Flower and Dean Street, the casual ward, or on the streets. After her murder, a group of homeless women were the first to come forward and identify her. Kate was described as, quote, "one of 10 or 20 houseless creatures who are without the means of paying their beds, who would regularly be found curled up in a shed off Dorset Street." Casual ward records show that Kate and John continued their peddler life, being recorded in Kent, London, Dartford, Sevenoaks and Chatham. Annie left home in her teens to live with Lewis Phillips, a lampblack packer. They would eventually marry. Annie would testify at the inquest that Kate would turn up at her door, drunk and demanding handouts. It got so frequent that the couple moved to avoid her. She said that as long as their mother drank, she could not maintain a relationship with her. But in August 1886, Annie did reach out for Kate's help. She was about to give birth to her 3rd child. Kate agreed to be there for Annie's period of confinement, but insisted that she be paid for her time. Annie did pay her, and Kate spent it on drink. Within 1 week, Kate had been thrown out and the women parted on bad terms. Annie moved and didn't leave a forwarding address. For Kate, her relationship with John was more of a practical one than one of deep love, although they did have a sincere affection for one another and were faithful to each other. He referred to Kate as his wife, although she used Conway and told John she was legally married. It was an easy relationship because there were no expectations. Despite being in a 7-year relationship with Kate, John knew very little about her. At the inquest, he didn't even know that she was born in Wolverhampton. He stayed away from her family, and he didn't cause her trouble. They formed a team committed to the survival of each other. His protection and occasional wages made life easier for a woman who was estranged from her family, suffered bereavement, experienced domestic violence, starvation, and the degradation of the workhouse. Their focus was on the here and now, food to fill their belly and drink to numb the feelings. At the end of summer 1888, John and Kate headed south to Kent to find work bringing in the hop harvest. It included free accommodation and drinks. The two had been regulars for the last few years. Unfortunately, it was a poor harvest, with many hops not considered worth picking. Many were forced to walk back to London having earned nothing. Kate and John had set out at the end of August to help bring in the fruit harvest, alongside hawking and any labouring work they could pick up. They headed towards Maidstone, where they heard the hop harvest was better, but were disappointed there was no work for non-locals. They made the decision to walk back to London. They arrived back on the 27th of September 1888. They had already spent all their earnings. They found shelter at the casual ward on Shoe Lane. It was a favourite of theirs, as the rules were not strictly enforced and they could escape early in the morning and avoid the expected day's work. They were released on the 28th, a Friday morning. John found work at Spitalfield Market and earned 6pence, enough for one of them to have a night's lodgings. That Friday night, Kate pawned John's boots where he stood barefoot in the doorway. Neither had eaten all day, the 6pence having been spent on alcohol. They got 2 shillings and 6, and they used it to buy provisions, tea and sugar, which Kate put in her skirt pockets. The rest was spent on drink throughout the evening. John took the last 4pence and got a bed at 52 Flower and Dean Street. There is no record of where Kate stayed, so it can be assumed she slept rough. The couple met at 8 a.m. the following morning. John was ashamed to admit this in the inquest. The murder spree had claimed 2 ladies at this point, and he allowed Kate to sleep rough, most likely in the Dorset Street shed, while he took a bed. The coroner was sceptical of John's testimony. The killer was targeting prostitutes after all, and there was no evidence or testimony that Kate had ever been one. John, Eliza her sister, Annie her daughter, and even Frederick William Wilkinson, the deputy lodging housekeeper at Cooney's, all testified that there was no evidence that Kate even ever solicited. Frederick had been familiar with the couple for 7 years and testified that he had never seen Kate even in the company of another man, and that she had been faithful to John. The coroner pressed John, but he insisted she had never gone out for immoral purposes at night, nor had she ever brought him money in the morning after being out. But John then used a phrase that the coroner seized upon when asked about their lack of doss house money. John said, "Well, I wouldn't want her to have to walk the streets." What John meant, and what he tried to clarify, was if they had to sleep rough, they would have to tramp the streets, as they were often moved on. But the coroner took it, and the press ran with it, as an admission that Kate was a lady of the night. The press talked of the ladies that slept in the shed as houseless waifs, penniless prostitutes like herself. The Saturday morning was spent in Cooney's communal kitchen contemplating the daily task of raising their doss money and extra for food and drink. They walked south towards Bishopsgate, and then in the early afternoon towards Houndsditch, the centre of the Jewish rag trade. John said Kate was thinking of selling one of her many layers of clothes, but they would have found it all closed, as Saturday is the Jewish Sabbath. Like most of John's account of their movements, the rest of the day is jumbled and hazy with alcohol. The couple parted ways around 4 p.m. By 8:30 p.m, Kate was paralytically drunk, in a heap against the wall at 20 Aldgate High Street. She was babbling and singing and cursing. She had drawn quite a crowd around her. A passing policeman saw the spectacle Kate was making, and with the assistance of a colleague, scooped her up and took her to Bishopsgate Police Station to sober up. She was placed in the cell, and when asked her name, she slurred nothing. At 1 a.m, she was released. She gave her name as Mary Ann Kelly of 6 Fashion Street, who had just returned to London from hop picking. He handed her back all her worldly possessions: 6 pieces of soap, a small tooth comb, a white-handled table knife and a metal teaspoon, a tin of teas and sugar, an empty tin matchbox, a piece of red flannel that contained needles and pins, a thimble, and a collection of menstruation rags. Also an empty red leather cigarette case and 2 short black clay pipes and a ball of hemp for selling. She refilled her skirt and prepared to leave. "What time is it?" she asked PC Hutt. "Too late for you to get a drink anywhere," he replied. "I shall get a damn fine hiding when I get home," she tells him. Hutt replies, "And serve you right, you had no right to get drunk." Hutt pushes open the swinging door of the station. "This way, missus," he says. "Please put it to." "All right," Kate replies. "Good night, old cock." Kate, still drunk, made her way along Duke Street. Probably in her repaired mind thought she could go and find John, so headed back to Houndsditch, where she last saw him. But soon realised that was a fool's errand, and that she should get some sleep. She soon found a spot in the far corner of Mitre Square. She sat her back against the wall as if a chair was supporting her. and Kate closed her eyes for the final time. Approximately 1:45 a.m, just 45 minutes after Kate left the police station, her body is discovered by PC Edward Watkins, the second victim in the double event. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, London's police surgeon, was called in and arrived around 2 a.m. An excerpt from his report reads, "The body was on its back, the head turned to the left shoulder, the arms by the side of the body as if they had fallen there, both palms upwards, the fingers slightly bent, the left leg extended in a line with the body, the abdomen was exposed, right leg bent at the thigh and knee, the throat cut across, the intestines were drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. They were smeared over with some feculent matter. A piece of about 2 feet were quite detached from the body and placed between the body and the left arm, apparently by design. The body was quite warm. No death stiffening had taken place. She must have been dead, most likely within the last half hour." The post-mortem was carried out by Dr. Brown on Sunday afternoon. Kate had been quite mutilated. In the face, the abdomen and genitals. Parts of her body had been removed and taken by the killer, the details of which I can't share with you on YouTube, but I placed a link in the description for you to read the full report. Certainly there was an escalation in damage inflicted. Could that be Jack's frustration after being disturbed with Elizabeth Stride earlier that night? On the morning of the 30th of September, police arrived at the door of Eliza Frost. They delivered the news that Kate was dead and that her body needed to be identified. Eliza, her son George, and John Kelly accompanied the inspector to the mortuary on Golden Lane. When the coffin lid was removed, Eliza screamed with anguish and was led from the room. Even though Kate's face had been disfigured, she could clearly see it was her. She cried, "Oh, my poor sister, that she should come to an end as this." The Eddowes family would not allow Kate to have a pauper's grave, and hundreds of Whitechapel residents lined the streets to give her a resounding send-off on the 8th of October. She was laid to rest at Manor Park Cemetery. Nearly 500 people gathered to pay their respects. Among them were many members of the Eddowes family that hadn't seen each other in years, mourning a loss that would reunite them. In the late 1996, the cemetery marked Kate's grave with a plaque. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and let me know what you think of this case in the comments below, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.